Quote, "My father worked and my mother played bridge. Every time I went out of the house, I was chauffeur driven with my nanny next to me to stop me being kidnapped." End quote. James Graham Ballard was born to English parents in Shanghai, China on November 15, 1930. His mother, a school teacher, taught him to read before entering school at age 5. He read children's editions of Alice in Wonderland, Robinson Crusoe, and Gulliver's Travels between reading American comics and magazines. He would later say how Alice, the Red Queen, and Man Friday would crowd a mental landscape also occupied by Superman, Buck Rogers, and Flash Gordon. Now, his favorite American comic strip was Terry and the Pirates, which he described as a wonderful oriental farrago of Chinese warlords, dragon ladies, and antique pagodas that had the added excitement of being set in the China where he lived. James was left to himself for long periods of time, during which he pretty much read any and everything he could find. Not only American comics, but Time and Life magazine, as well as the Saturday Evening Post and the New Yorker. Simultaneously, he read childhood classics such as Peter Pan and Winnie the Pooh. A big turning point occurred at age 12 when he produced his first piece of writing. In school, he and his schoolmates were instructed to copy lines from stories. According to James, the teachers really didn't care at all if they wrote it line by line. All that mattered was to see that the paper was covered. Well, it was while copying the lines of a thriller that young James realized that it was easier if he didn't bother at all to transcribe, rather just to make up the story himself. It was then that he first discovered how exciting it was to invent things. That set him off. In the interim, the Second Sino-Japanese War commenced, lasting from 1937 to 1945, forcing the Ballards to abandon their suburban home and move to the city center of Shanghai in order to avoid the warfare. And by the time the war ceased, Ballard was 15 years old and on his way back to England with the family. Upon arriving in Plymouth circa late 1945, early 46, he was faced with what he considered to be an incomprehensible and strange new life, one which his childhood of extensive reading had prepared him for in more ways than he'd realized. Fortunately, there would be vast amounts of new literature to comfort him, but also a new venture of pop culture to explore, cinema. So for the next 4 to 5 years, he put reading mostly aside and dove into movies. He saw a connection between the works of Hemingway, Nathaniel West, Kafka, and Camus, and the up-and-coming Hollywood films of the time, such as Citizen Kane, Sunset Boulevard, and White Heat. Around this same time, he found his way into the world of psychoanalysis and surrealism, a fusion that would fuel the short stories he was already writing and which would further his decision to start reading and studying about medicine. Roughly 20 years old upon entering the annual short story competition in Cambridge, he won. Already convinced by then that he wanted to be a writer, the award was reassurance. By the time he came out of the Air Force at the age of 24, he'd written a number of short stories and was also, according to him, vaguely writing a novel. He felt, however, that something was missing from most of the fiction being published at the time. It didn't seem real enough or interesting enough. He felt that the sort of fiction people were writing in those days just wasn't about the world he was living in. He saw the mid-1950s as being more and more dominated by science and technology. Thus, the only fiction that was about life then was science fiction. It was a paradox. You see, people thought of science fiction as something fantastic and remote from ordinary experiences. Well, he felt that was the wrong impression to be left with. Rather, he saw science fiction as a marvelous area, a tremendously exciting area with great potential that should be explored. His first published short story, Prima Bella Donna, appeared in the magazine Science Fantasy in 1956. The situation for science fiction writers at the time was one every freelancer must dream about. Payments were small, a flat rate of £2 per 1,000 words. But the point about writing for science fiction magazines was that the demand was unlimited. There was pressure from the editor. If one had any talent at all, one could land a story in every issue of a magazine for a whole year. That's if you were productive and talented enough. He continued writing short stories until 1961, just upon the time he produced his first novel, The Wind from Nowhere. Now, at the time, Ballard and his wife were extremely short of money. The one thing he wanted to do was give up his job as the editor of a scientific magazine and write a decent novel. Now, he had 2 weeks of vacation coming up, and so his wife put forth a challenge saying, "Why don't you, just for the hell of it, write a novel in 2 weeks?" He answered with The Wind from Nowhere, writing it in approximately 10 days. He set the formidable target of writing close to 6,000 words a day, which he kept up for 10 days. Now, the book was no more than a potboiler, but that potboiler provided the funding that enabled him to give up that magazine job in order to concentrate on writing. Soon after his first serious novel, The Drowned World, was published in 1962, he followed it with The Drought in 1965 and The Crystal World in 1966, which are now generally known as the Catastrophic Trilogy. What came next, however, would truly cement his name as a writer to be reckoned with.